Hi, this is Bill with Orchids 101. Today we're going to be talking about how to repot your Phalaenopsis orchid, which is probably the most common type that you're going to receive as a gift from one of your friends. And you obviously want to enjoy it for many years. And this will help you to learn how to care for it and keep it blooming for many years in the future. Okay, yeah, this is the most common kind of orchid that you're going to see in the big box stores, supermarkets. It's called a Phalaenopsis, otherwise known as a moth orchid. And what you're going to find is some of them are potted up in a dense ball of sphagnum moss. Others are potted up, as this one is here, because this one has been repotted multiple times. This is potted up in orchid bark. If you have a choice, pick one that's potted up in bark because it's going to be much easier to care for it without drowning it and killing it due to overwatering that you can run into with plants that are potted up in sphagnum moss. In any case, with this type of orchid, you want to repot it every 2 years roughly. And what you'll find is that after a while the bark will start to break down, it'll hold more water, and that's what's going to damage the roots. So that's why you want to keep a new, fresh potting medium around the roots so that they get air in between being watered. So what we're going to do is take a look at this now. This has got a nice, healthy new growth, a brand new leaf here. You've got a lot of new roots that are starting to grow, and this is an optimum time to be repotting this plant. And again, you see the new growth, the new roots growing here. These are not the spikes that the flowers bloom from, but they're going to grow into the mix and on the surface. You don't want to damage the roots. Roots on orchids are very fragile and they don't heal themselves if they're damaged. And this one actually does have the start of a new spike here, which is going to probably bloom. It'll take months to bloom, to mature to the point where it will start to open up for you. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do is to remove the plant from the pot, disposing of all of the mix, the broken down bark, and be careful with it that you don't end up damaging the roots. I'll mention that you want to pot a plant like this in a plastic pot because the roots otherwise, if you plant it in a clay pot, the roots will adhere to the clay and there's no way to remove the plant without damaging the roots. Now you can see this has got a very, very healthy set of roots filling the pot. What we're going to do is gently remove as much of the old bark as possible and the sphagnum moss. And where some of the older roots have completely dried up, we're going to trim those off after we remove the remaining potting material. And it's not unusual to see roots that have a green appearance because this particular type of orchid, the roots naturally grow in the air. This is a plant that naturally grows in trees, and the roots themselves perform photosynthesis just as the leaves do on the plant in nature. So we're cleaning this off, getting most of the material cleaned off from the plant. Now what we're going to do is trim off any excess old roots from the plant. Always make sure that your cutting tools, have been disinfected before taking them to the plant. Orchids are subject to virus and there is no cure. Once the plant has virus, you'll start to see the plant doesn't grow as vigorously. The flowers are distorted, the colors of the flowers are distorted. The only way to deal with it is to destroy the plant. So what I'm using is a simple propane torch. Make sure that the blades are well sterilized. If you don't want to use a torch, use a 10% solution of chlorine bleach. Soak the tool in the bleach for 10 minutes before taking it from one plant to the next. So now these roots that are completely dried and brown, these can be trimmed off. And besides improving the appearance of the plant, if you have decaying roots in the mix, that can cause fungus infections, which also can lead to a much diminished vigor in the plant. So what we want to do is to clean this up as much as possible. This one doesn't have any old leaves that we need to cut off. We'll be looking at a plant that probably could have used some repotting several years ago in a future video. And that's probably about as much as we need to do. This is, again, has a very healthy root system. And now we'll just set that aside and prepare the new pot for the plant. When selecting a pot for an orchid, remember, water is the enemy. Overwatering is the enemy of orchids. They almost all grow in trees or on rocks. The roots are exposed to the air. They may get rained on every day, but then they dry out in between. So make sure that your pot has ample drainage. If it doesn't have enough holes in the pot, just take your drill and open it up so that when you water it, the water just flows through freely. And make sure that you don't then set it into a container that retains the water. Make sure that any excess water is drained out first before you, say, put your plant into a decorative pot that may not have drain holes. A preference of mine, I always add about an inch of rock, gravel in the bottom of the pot. Having the layer of gravel at the bottom of the pot also gives an area for any water to collect and drain out as some of the mix starts to break down. So it adds some additional aeration into the root zone. Now, there are many different types of mix that you can use for your plant, for your orchid. For orchids that have heavy roots like a Phalaenopsis, you use fairly coarse bark. Make sure you buy orchid bark, not the decorative bark that's used for landscaping. This is what's considered medium grade. You could use medium or a coarser grade for this type of a plant. What I use is a mix of the medium bark. I do use some sphagnum moss because this helps to retain moisture, but I'll take some and just shred it into smaller sections so it's easier to disperse in the bark. This is a far cry from the solid mass of sphagnum moss that you'll find many of the retail plants potted in. And we'll talk about what you do in that case in a future episode. Mix those up, mix those together well. I use maybe about a quarter of the sphagnum moss to the amount of bark that I use in the mix. Make sure that's well mixed. And then the secret ingredient. I started adding styrofoam peanut pieces to the mix a few years ago. And what I found then is the leaves of the Phalaenopsis plants almost doubled in size. Again, because you're keeping the mix more open to the air and you have less chance of the roots decaying because they're being too waterlogged. And you can see the evidence of that in this plant here, which just has a phenomenal root ball. And you don't need too much. Just take the styrofoam, break it up into little quarter-inch size pieces, roughly a couple of handfuls of it is sufficient. Make sure that the styrofoam, that the peanuts, the packing peanuts really are styrofoam and they're not the biodegradable type that will dissolve in water. Add some water to that. Make sure that the bark and the moss are evenly moist. And then in potting the plant, start with a layer right on top of the rock at the bottom of this prepared mix. And now take your plant and work it so that the roots are down in the pot. Any roots that want to creep out of the pot, just let them go. Remember, in nature, all of these roots are basically exposed to the air. The only reason for putting it in a pot with a mix is so that it can sit on your counter. And then gently work the mix around the roots. Some people have said, gee, if the roots are growing out of the pot, should I just take them and bend them and stick them back in the pot? You're going to damage the roots. You just don't want to do that. And then just generally tap it to work the mix down in amongst the roots. It's not necessary to have it completely packed with mix. Not necessary to get all those roots down in the mix. Pack it down a bit, and now you're ready to go. Okay, thanks for joining us today. We'll be having additional videos showing other aspects of caring for your orchids, other types of orchids, how to rebloom them, how to grow them outdoors in different environments. We hope you'll give us a thumbs up on the video and subscribe to our channel, and check out the links below for some of the products that were mentioned in the video.